A cruel uncle delighted in bullying his 7-year-old nephew. Strike after strike rained down on the child's bare back, yet the child remained silent, neither whimpering nor struggling. With astonishing fortitude, he endured the ordeal, waiting for the right moment to end. The uncle, perceiving his forbearance, intensified his violence, increasing the frequency and severity of the blows, attempting to break the child's will. But Andreas Egger, with his steely will, remained unyielding, facing all the abuse with a stoic stoicism until he was 12 years old. He accidentally overturned a wheelbarrow, and his stern uncle, observing this, fetched a hazelnut stick again and ordered him to lie bare-chested on a wooden bench, enduring the punishment he had already inflicted countless times. This time, the punishment was so severe that it broke one of Andreas's legs. The bedridden teenager, his face pale, was soothed by his elderly grandmother, who whispered, "Your injuries will heal, and there will be a brighter future." Andreas was filled with resentment and anger, but he ultimately gave up his plan. His grandmother's kindness kept him from making up his mind. At the age of 7, Andreas' parents died. Left alone, he had no choice but to live with his uncle, where he fell into a life of darkness. His uncle's family treated him harshly. He wasn't allowed to eat at the same table, and his 2 cousins bullied him as if he were an outsider. They denied him the right to attend school and treated him like a slave. Thankfully, his elderly grandmother cared deeply for the poor child. She not only secretly provided him with food, but also, without telling her family, taught him to read and write. Time passed, and Andreas was already 17. Though fate had taken away a leg, it had also gifted him with a strong body. His cruel uncle eventually suffered his due. His 2 biological sons both contracted diphtheria and died before reaching adulthood, leaving Andreas as the sole able-bodied laborer in the family. Unexpectedly, war broke out and conscription was called for the front lines, including Andreas. Upon hearing the news, his uncle immediately made a stern appeal to the officers. He'd already lost his 2 sons. If he took his adopted son with him, who would do the heavy farm work? Who would provide the soldiers with fodder? The officers agreed. The loss of 1 soldier could be compensated, but a loss of supplies would be disastrous. In the end, Andreas was spared from the fighting. That same day, his grandmother, who loved him dearly, collapsed beside a wash basin while kneading dough from constant overwork and never regained consciousness. After the church farewell ceremony, Andreas hid alone in the bushes, weeping inconsolably. From then on, he lost the love of his loved ones, but also released all his worries. To avenge the humiliation of the past and to protect his still crippled leg, Andreas finally resolved to carry out the plan he had hatched countless times since childhood. That noon, Andreas deliberately smashed his plate, then expertly crouched on a wooden stool, the posture of a tamed dog. But when his uncle asked him to remove his trousers, he abruptly stood up, his eyes gleaming with ferocity, and sternly warned his uncle. With that, he packed his empty bag and resolutely left the village that had shackled his freedom. It turned out that what Andreas truly longed for wasn't revenge, but the resolve and opportunity to sustain his journey. Andreas gazed at the towering peaks in the distance, embarking on a journey he had never set foot on before. From then on, his life was closely tied to the Alps, as dramatic and majestic as the mountains themselves. With a sturdy physique he'd forged since childhood, he made his living by working the fields for the townspeople or cutting wood in the snowy mountains. Time flew by, and 10 years passed. Andreas's once empty bag was now filled with heavy gold coins. Andreas hurried through the snowy mountains and forests toward the next town. On a desolate hillside, he discovered a dilapidated wooden house where an elderly man, suffering from illness, lay within. Thinking of his deceased grandmother, he felt a surge of longing, unable to bear the thought of her passing alone, and so he bravely carried her on his back. The forest was silent, the only sounds being the clatter of footsteps and the old man's heavy breathing, like rusted machinery. Suddenly, the old man cleared his throat and spoke with difficulty. "Death is not to be feared. Before you move forward, you must first consider the destination of your soul. The cold wind will penetrate your bones and crush your will. People say that death is a rebirth, but it is like a cold woman taking your life, leaving you with a bone-chilling cold and endless darkness." These words chilled Andreas' heart. Death, a death he had never deeply considered, felt like cold snow on his neck. He shuddered and tumbled down the slippery slope. When he regained consciousness, the old man had vanished in the wind, snow, and vast expanse of white. This seemed deeply shocked Andreas. He had previously had no hope for the future, and the occasional imagination he had felt was as hazy as the morning mist. But now he began to look forward, longing to make a difference before his death. Perhaps this was what it meant to live towards death. Just then, a woman quietly approached and gently placed a glass of wine in front of Andreas. As Marie placed the glass, her slender fingers brushed Andreas's rough arm. Instantly, Andreas' heart stirred, and he realized his life's purpose, to marry his beloved and build a warm haven. From then on, he became increasingly diligent. He braved the scorching sun in the fields and the biting cold in the jungle, willingly accepting any kind of labor without a single complaint. Finally, he saved enough to rent a cabin halfway up a mountain. The cabin was simply furnished, but the windows offered a breathtaking view of the Alps. Andreas also cultivated a vegetable patch in front of his house, planting a variety of fruits and vegetables due to the abundant sunlight. With a stable home, Andreas decided to formally pursue Marie, but his inherent simplicity and honesty kept him hesitant to act rashly. The owner of the tavern where Marie worked noticed his feelings and bluntly advised him, "Marie is a workaholic and has never considered marriage and family." He tried to dissuade him from the idea, but reality quickly overturned the boss's judgment. 1 week later, Marie spotted Andreas from a distance and actually approached him. The two already had a crush on each other, and their relationship quickly blossomed. Soon, Andreas invited Marie to visit his cabin. Marie was speechless at the magnificent view. Nervous, Andreas, however, spoke eloquently, detailing the advantages of his living environment and showcasing the interior decor. Andreas also discussed his life plans, solemnly promising that he would never be content with being an ordinary farmer, nor would he be confined to working the land for the rest of his life. Andreas was unaware that, from the moment they first met, Marie had already considered him her destiny and was willing to spend the rest of her life with her. After receiving Marie's emotional response, Andreas realized that his current income would not be enough to give her the ideal life she desired. Coincidentally, a construction team arrived in the village, planning to build a cable car system in the Alps to facilitate tourists from the foothills to the higher altitudes for skiing. The project was in urgent need of workers, and Andreas decided to apply. At first, the project manager, seeing his leg disability, thought he wouldn't be able to handle the arduous mountain climbing. But Andreas straightened his back and said firmly, "My limp doesn't affect my mobility. You'd be at a loss if you didn't hire me." Perhaps moved by his confidence, the manager finally agreed to hire him. From then on, Andreas devoted himself to the construction site, performing as reliably and efficiently as promised, expertly securing steel structures with ropes and precisely locating blasting points on sheer cliffs. As his career progressed steadily, his relationship with Marie remained sweet and harmonious. One day, Andreas and Marie stood on a mountainside, gazing out at the golden sunlight pouring down on the Alps, its rays filtering through the clouds and gilding the snow-capped peaks with a dazzling silver hue. The scenery was breathtakingly magnificent. Marie suddenly exclaimed, "These mountains are like fine porcelain. If you're not careful, they'll shatter into countless pieces." Andreas softly agreed, but his thoughts were already swirling. Even the most stunning scenery pales in comparison when he's in the company of his beloved. Finally, unable to contain his surging emotions, he passionately kissed Marie on the lips, and she responded with a gentle kiss. After that intimate encounter, Andreas desperately wanted to marry Marie. His coworkers suggested proposing in writing, but he felt that wasn't formal enough. Gazing at the towering mountains in the distance, a romantic conception of love blossomed in his mind. After completing his plans, Andreas invited Marie to a picturesque forest where they sat quietly facing each other on a breezy meadow. As dusk fell and the sun set, a brilliant flame suddenly blazed from a distant mountaintop, and upon closer inspection, the word Marie shone brightly. With the help of his coworkers, Andreas overcame numerous obstacles and expressed his passionate love for Marie in such a stunning way that it illuminated the entire valley. His sincere confession deeply moved Marie, and she accepted without hesitation. Soon, Andreas and Marie married and lived together in a cozy cabin. To provide Marie with a better life, Andreas approached the construction site manager, pleading for more work opportunities. The person in charge frankly admitted, "What Andreas wants isn't more work, but solid financial support. Because of his outstanding performance, we've decided to pay him an extra 20 cents per hour without increasing his workload." Grateful, Andreas worked even harder. Until one day, as he and his coworkers were pulling the cable to the top of the mountain, a sawn-off pine tree suddenly fell, severing one of his coworkers' arms. The scene was covered in blood, but no one showed fear or pity, as if such accidents were commonplace. Soon after, the first cable car was operating smoothly. As participants in the project, all workers were invited to attend the opening ceremony. Watching the cable car soaring through the sky, Andreas cast aside the bloodshed and sacrifices, feeling an unprecedented sense of joy and accomplishment. In mid-spring, the ice and snow melted and the earth came alive. Andreas was planning to expand his vegetable garden and grow more crops. Meanwhile, Marie was pregnant. At this moment, the two of them were filled with hope for the future, their hope for life stronger than ever. But this sweet happiness was suddenly shattered one harsh winter. That night, Andreas was sleeping peacefully, holding Marie in his arms, when an eerie sound startled him awake. He stepped out of the cabin to investigate, and a powerful whirlwind suddenly struck. When the wind died down, the morning light bathed the earth, but Andreas was buried deep in the snow, with only his mouth and nose to breathe. As soon as he regained consciousness, he cried out heartbreakingly for Marie, but only suffocating silence answered. Incredulously, he struggled free from the snowdrifts. Though his legs were severely frostbitten, he braved the excruciating pain and crawled forward, searching for his wife. Even though his hands were raw and bleeding, he could not find the familiar figure, Marie, their unborn child, and even their cabin completely buried by the relentless snowstorm. At the solemn funeral, a grief-stricken Andreas, like a hollow soul, numbly endured the villagers' routine condolences. Afterward, he was forcibly taken back to town to recuperate, and months later, he could barely walk. One morning, as the snow melted, Andreas looked toward his former home. Finally, despite his frail frame, he leaned on his crutches and stumbled back to the devastated ruins. After the snow melted, his homeland was left only mud and desolate. Yet, amidst the desolation, he caught a glimpse of a familiar hem of a skirt hanging from a branch. It was Marie's dress. Andreas's memory instantly flashed back to the summer they first met. Marie wore this summer dress on a date, her blonde hair gently lifted in the sweltering heat, revealing the scar on her neck from a childhood sow bite. At the time, he gently comforted her. Scars, like time, accumulate year by year, ultimately shaping the unique Marie. Thinking back now, Andreas felt even more heartbroken. He had promised to protect Marie, but in the end, he couldn't save her life. After his leg injury healed, Andreas immediately went to the cable car company to demand an explanation for Marie's death. He had clearly heard the construction crews blasting during the avalanche and suspected it was caused by deliberate blasting. But the cable car company owner refused to acknowledge the truth. Faced with a vastly superior company, Andreas knew he couldn't compete. He could only swallow his anger and endure all the pain and resentment alone. To make matters worse, he had to continue working for the construction crew to make a living. Soon after, Andreas returned to work, depressed and withdrawn, studiously avoiding everyone. Seeing that he still struggled to come to terms with his wife's death, his former closest coworker gently advised him, "Death and death are normal in life, but sooner or later, everything will vanish without a trace." Faced with his coworker's relentless admonitions, Andreas finally lost control and firmly retorted, "Humans have souls and willpower." But his coworker dismissed him, bluntly stating, "This is pure nonsense. Death is like the extinguishing of a candle, and everything after death is illusory. There is no God, and even if there were, the heaven he promised would never be as far-fetched as it is now. Life is unpredictable." Shortly after that conversation, the coworker froze to death in the bathtub without warning. At the funeral, the same eulogy was mechanically recited. In the mountains, he ran faster than an antelope, worked like a galloping horse, and yet he died like this. As the priest said, the path to heaven is deep and unfathomable. The mourners all wore somber expressions, but Andreas's eyes suddenly gleamed with a strange light. Death, as the old man in the forest had said, brings nothing new. It is simply the end, without regard for soul, will, or God. Death is ultimately unavoidable, and it will come to everyone equally at any time. From then on, Andreas was completely unafraid of death, nor of any loss. He resolutely took on the perilous job of maintaining the cable car, even at heights of dozens of meters. Facing the constant risk of falling to pieces, he remained calm and composed. As the days passed in peace, he no longer suppressed his longing for Marie. Instead, he poured his feelings into letters, expressing his love and reverently placing them at Marie's grave. These seemingly lonely days were, for him, a fresh start. But fate dealt him another fatal blow. World War II broke out, and a large number of young men went to war, and the cable car that once shattered the silence of the Alps ceased operation. Andreas, who had vowed never to farm, was forced to pick up his sickle again and work alongside the women and children left behind in the town. Just as he finished harvesting one season's crops, a conscription announcement rang out throughout the town. With his expertise in aerial work, Andreas was sent to the Caucasus Mountains, drilling blast holes and placing explosives in the rock face, while also serving as forward security and guarding the defense line. At first, he could still see his comrades in the neighboring mountains through a telescope, but soon he felt as if he had been abandoned by the world. With no trace of his comrades, he found himself alone in the freezing cold, huddled in a damp cave, barely surviving with a feeble fire and expired canned food. After an unknown amount of time, Andreas, out of ammunition and food and in dire straits, dragged his weakened body slowly out of the cave. Amidst the vast expanse of snow, he suddenly caught sight of a familiar flag. With his last remaining strength, he stumbled towards it, only to realize it was the enemy camp. Long-term hunger and cold had clouded his mind, and he had mistaken the enemy for his comrades. And thus, he tragically became a prisoner of war. In the prison camp, Andreas suffered immense torture, yet he never uttered a single complaint or resentment. Having witnessed countless scenes of death, he was filled with gratitude for still being alive, still able to gaze at the stars in the night sky and continue writing letters to Marie, telling his heart out. Years after the war subsided, Andreas regained his freedom. After a long journey, he finally set foot on the familiar land of the Alps. On his first day back home, he headed straight for his deceased wife's grave, parted the thick weeds covering the grave, and placed the letters he had accumulated over the years into the grave, bidding Marie a final farewell. Then, leaning on a single crutch, he slowly walked through the streets of his childhood town, reminiscing through the fragments of his memories. Unexpectedly, he ran into his utterly hated uncle. Although he was now fading in age, a dying candle in the wind, he still shuddered at the horrific memories that had etched him deeply. After a moment, Andreas regained his courage and resolutely approached the man who had once been a nightmare, gazing down at him from above. Now, his uncle was teetering on the brink of death, begging Andreas for help. But Andreas simply turned away coldly sometimes. Preventing those who long for death from finding liberation is a form of revenge. Later, to make a living, Andreas took odd jobs on a farm, toiling daily just to put food on the table. But his state of mind had changed completely. Though alone, he found a self-sufficient peace. He accepted the past with equanimity and relished his solitude. In this unprecedented freedom, his worldview quietly shifted, all his obsessions gradually dissipated. He began to live purely, not wallowing in sorrow and pain, not complaining or fighting, but simply adapting to circumstances and doing what he could. His steps were still unsteady, but he exuded an unusual firmness and composure. The scars of the past, layered together, had become a tough shell, allowing him to remain unfazed despite the turmoil of the outside world. Though fate had taken away so much from him, all that remained was the pure essence of existence. Time flew by, and more than a decade had passed in the blink of an eye. Andreas, now gray-haired, remained a wanderer, constantly on the move. He moved from place to place, often living in his employer's stable. In his 70s, thanks to the help of a tavern owner, he finally found a decent place to live, a 2-story house on the verge of demolition. The upstairs served as a makeshift classroom for the town students, and the downstairs served as his bedroom. Andreas had imagined the rest of his life would be spent in loneliness and obscurity, but then he unexpectedly met an elegant and cheerful elderly woman. The woman seemed to have taken a liking to him from the moment they met, and she frequently made overtures to him. This genuine friendship touched Andreas, and the two began a romantic relationship that rivaled their youth. They rode cable cars together to admire the breathtaking alpine scenery and walked together in the mountains, enjoying the warm spring breeze. At one point, Andreas had a sudden illusion. It was as if the hardships of the past had never happened, and he was back to his 40s, full of enthusiasm for life. Illusions are ultimately false. When the old woman offered to spend the rest of her life with him, Andreas's mind suddenly flashed back to Marie's face, and heart-wrenching memories flooded back. Determined that he would never again be involved in love, he immediately declined the offer. After the old house, a symbol of his past, was demolished, Andreas, packing only his belongings, moved alone into a stone cabin deep in the mountains. Though lonely, it suited his heart. Being there always reminded him of the wooden house, once filled with happiness, and brought back lingering thoughts of Marie. Even when he occasionally went down the mountain to buy groceries, he mostly remained alone in the stone cabin, sleeping in his clothes when sleepy, bathing in the icy mountain springs when exhausted. Even if passers-by passed by, he remained oblivious, as if cut off from the world, self-sufficient, a world of his own, a peaceful mind, and self-sufficient in everything. Though alone, with an uncertain future ahead, he felt a clear sense of the abundance of completeness and fulfillment. As consciousness gradually cleared, the painful memories of the past, deeply embedded in his memory, faded like fleeting clouds. It wasn't until he came down the mountain again, watching footage of astronauts landing on the moon, that Andreas suddenly realized how much time he had already spent on Earth. On the way back to the stone house from town, he saw a crowd surrounding a fire truck in the distance. As he approached, Andreas was stunned. The fire truck was pulling the same old man he had encountered in the woods decades ago. The old man's body, dried to a dusty state, had been discovered by hikers in a glacial crevasse. Everyone lamented his fate, but Andreas knew only that he had passed away peacefully. In his final moments, he would surely smile, for he had long understood the true meaning of death. Death is but a cold woman clad in frost, and when the snow falls, he will merge with the vast earth. In the days that followed, Andreas seemed to hear the call of death. His appetite gradually decreased, and his reactions grew slower. One day, on a whim, he boarded a tour bus bound for the mountaintop. The driver asked him his destination, and he replied, "The last stop." The bus rolled down a winding mountain road, the scenery unfolding slowly along the way. A yellow sunset wove in a hazy mist, waterfalls cascading over rocks, water flowing endlessly for millennia, withered grass turning yellow, fresh snow blanketing the mountains and plains shifting in all directions, the winds and clouds turning. Gazing out the window at the magnificent scene, Andreas's eyes flashed back to unforgettable moments from his life: sadness, joy, bitterness, and happiness. He couldn't help but burst into tears. After getting off the bus, he walked alone to a deserted observation deck. Gazing at the majestic mountains in the distance, he felt a sense of unprecedented contentment. That night, Andreas continued writing to Marie, "Dear Marie, I never believed in God, nor do I fear death. Like everyone else, I had dreams and hopes, some fulfilled, some forever unattainable, or lost only to be lost. I can't remember where I came from, nor where I'm going, but now I'm looking back on my life. If I weren't so exhausted, I might have laughed out loud at pure happiness." With that letter, Andreas passed away. Later, the villagers buried his coffin alongside Marie's, and the letters they had accumulated over decades fluttered out like butterflies, forever lingering between them. Life is a journey through the sea of love and desire, born alone and lost alone, bearing the joys and sorrows of life alone. No one can replace them. 100 years, that's all. This series ends here. Thank you for your support, and see you next time.